Hey everybody, and welcome to part 5 of Science versus Atheism, entitled Logic and Reason. The following is a brief and incomplete outline of precise logic and reason. To one not familiar with this content, the following may be challenging. Number 1. Metalogic. This consists of the list of the rules of inference. These are the rules by whose application the information content of statements within a given system change linguistic form or expression. We shall assume the standard metalogic since it is the intuitive one, hence the one most will be familiar with. It is designed to parallel the reasoning processes of our culture and within which our society thinks. The law of implication, as given earlier in the discussion of fallacies, is an example of a rule of inference. Another example is the law of the excluded middle, which means, in words rather than symbolism, any statement P is either valid or not valid, but not both. Number 2. Basic terms. This list consists of introduced terms that are to be related in the axioms, or assumptions. Examples of basic terms are, from geometry, point and line. Number 3. Defined terms. These consist of terms introduced for shorthand purposes. When certain relationships occur or are referred to with sufficient frequency, instead of repeatedly reciting the accompanying conditions, a single term is invented as a referent thereto. For example, from geometry, parallel. Number 4. Axioms. These are statements within the overlying language of relationships and/or conditions between basic terms. For example, from geometry, any two distinct points determine a line. Number 5. Theorems. These are statements of implication, if P, then Q, where P is the list of hypotheses, aka assumptions or presumptives, and Q is a list of conclusions that are claimed to be consequences of P within the context of the given system. The justification as to the validity of a given theorem is executed by means of what is called a proof. For non-vacuous statements, this proceeds by beginning with the information content of P and, by use of the rules of inference, the axioms and prior validated results producing Q. It is seminal to note that a theorem may be shown to be valid, but that in no way justifies the claim to the validity of the hypotheses. It is the theorem that is valid, not the hypotheses. Even in the precision of logic, a theorem is only a hypothetical statement. If the correctness of the hypotheses is to be confirmed, that process lies outside the theorem itself. To assert otherwise in the presence of the standard metalogic is to commit a meta-fallacy. This is the reason for the inclusion of the law of implication in the metalogic. For example, if 1 equals 2, then 3 equals 6 divided by 2 is a valid theorem, but 1 equals 2 is not a valid statement. Also, if it is raining, then the surface is moist is a valid assertion, but there are times when the surface is not moist, and there are times when the surface is moist, but it is not raining, yet the theorem is still valid. It is of critical importance to note that 1. In precise language, the only thing that one can prove is a theorem. If the statement is not a theorem, then the term proof cannot, in precision, be properly applied to it. To do so is to commit the fallacy of transfer as to the term proof. Number 2, whatever information there is that is produced as a conclusion of a theorem must be previously contained within that system wherein the proof was executed, and then only hypothetically. All a proof can do is make explicit information that is implicit. In plain words, one cannot prove what one has not first assumed. That information may not be transparently there, but if it is not there implicitly, then it cannot be shown to be there explicitly. That is, it cannot be obtained in the conclusion. In fact, the purpose of all logic processes is to make explicit, in the conclusion, that which to the viewer may be implicit in the structure. If the information is not in the system to begin with, it cannot, by proof, be shown to be a conclusion of a theorem within the system. For example, if one proves as a conclusion, by logic, that God does not exist, then that information was forced to have been assumed within the logic system from which it was derived. But this is a two-edged sword. The same applies to the statement, God exists. Which statement is logical? Answer, both are. In point of fact, due to the nature of formal logic, for any statement one wishes to make, there will exist logic systems for which that statement is a conclusion for vacuous and for valid non-vacuous theorems. One may even have to embed it in a system with a non-standard metalogic, but it is so. Can such really be? Absolutely yes. Then how can the word truth make any sense or have any substantive meaning? Answer: by realizing that contrary to Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and the majority of the classical and modern philosophers, logic does not yield truth. Logic can only make explicit that partial content of that which is implicit within the presumptives of the system, including the metalogic, the axioms, and the hypotheses, and then even only hypothetically. It is because of this problem we have been using the term valid as it relates to logic rather than the term true. Then to what does the term truth relate? A statement is true if it is a sufficiently accurate representation within the particular dialect of the subject-predicate-modifier language that we possess of something that relates to the real universe of physical actual existence and/or its associated experiences. Note here that the terms explicit and implicit, as well as making sense and not making sense, are subjective. That is, what is explicit to one may be implicit to another. Similarly, what makes sense to one may not make sense to another. Moreover, a statement may be pure nonsense to understanding and yet be perfectly logical within a given context. Occasionally, the term illogical is improperly used in reference to a statement that does not coincide with a particular position. The term illogical properly refers to information that feign claims to be within the content of a given logic system, but is not. Thus, the term is context-dependent. If one wishes to be precise, then the term illogical has no other proper or correct meaning. The statements God exists and God does not exist, as to truth, are not within the domain of logic to evaluate, since they are statements pertaining to claims concerning the real universe of actual existence, and, as noted, either is valid, each in different logic systems. In general, nothing within the universe of reality is subject to nor derivative of anything within the fantasy world of logic, that is, the world of the imagination created by logic. We may reason as we wish, but not one iota of our reasoning transfers anything from that domain of the mind into the domain of the real world, contrary to Plato's explanations, concepts, and structures within his world of forms and ideals. Logic and reason may give us clues and ideas, but the only link that we have between the real universe and the structures of logic is the scientific method, as described earlier. And even that, as noted previously, cannot justify hypotheses as truths. For example, trees are not consequences of any logic system, and verification as to tree existence and any tree-related information is not confirmed by logic. Such information relating to them must, if correct, be verified by physical experience. The relative communication constitutes nothing more nor less than testimony as to tests and interactions. As noted earlier, test and testimony are at the foundation of application of the scientific method. There is much aesthetic enjoyment in playing games and reasoning within this imaginary world of the mind, and mathematicians and philosophers make a good living doing so, but these games are still just mental constructions, nothing more. The only real external value these activities of the mind have is that linked by the interconnections made through the methodologies of true science. Now that concludes my father's very abbreviated presentation on logic and reason. I wanted to punctuate my father's discussion on logic by pointing out that when people typically use the term logical, they're not referring to actual formal logic as presented here. The term logical is most often used in an attempt to make one's own subjective opinion sound authoritative. In these cases, it's implied that conflicting points of view are therefore illogical. But like it or not, as my father says, two opposing statements can both be designated as logical depending on the logic systems in which they're used. Meanwhile, truth itself is remarkably elusive. Or, as my father very accurately put it, logic does not yield truth. If you come to believe that it does, then you get lost in a maze of subjective definitions which become true to you because you made them logical within your own mind. This is why the question of theism will never be resolved by debate. And if you want examples of this, then look no further than people who behave like fascists while calling themselves anti-fascist. Or people like Bill Nye denying the simple definitions associated with human biology. See, when you believe that logic yields truth, as ancient and modern philosophers do, then the world melts down into a soup of subjective nonsense. Logic in most contexts is completely subjective. And that's going to wrap it up for this part. In part 6, we will discuss facts, and also because it's such a short section, about a paragraph long, we will discuss self-evident truths. Thank you for listening.